I went on a solo camping trip last fall. I'd done a few solo trips before, but I'd always picked areas that were either close to small towns or within busy parks where I'd see other hikers or campers every now and then. This time, though, I wanted to get a little further out, just to see how it would feel to be really alone in the woods. I wasn't chasing some big, finding myself thing or anything like that. I just liked the quiet. The place I chose was in the northern part of my state, way up in the forest, far from the popular trails. It was a stretch of old logging roads that were barely used anymore. You could drive in for about an hour on gravel roads until they pretty much just disappeared into weeds and brush. I picked it because the maps showed a couple of small lakes and open spots that weren't official campsites but looked like good clearings. I packed my gear carefully. I had my tent, food for 4 days, plenty of water, a filter, a basic first aid kit, a good knife, and a small hatchet. I had my GPS and paper maps, along with extra batteries and a power bank. I felt good about it. I wasn't worried. I'd gone camping alone before. I knew how to handle myself out there. The drive out was quiet. After the last small town, I didn't see another car. I stopped once at a narrow bridge to check the map. I remember noticing how silent it was. No cars, no houses, not even power lines out there. I kept driving until the road got too rough, and I parked just off the gravel and hiked the rest of the way in, maybe a mile and a half. I found a flat clearing near one of the small lakes. It wasn't much of a lake, more like a wide pond with some thick reeds along the edges. I set up camp, made a small fire, cooked some ramen, and just settled in. Felt peaceful being that far from everything. The first night was uneventful. I heard the usual sounds: wind in the trees, a few frogs from the lake, some small animals rustling in the underbrush. I slept fine. The second day, I hiked around the lake and explored a bit. I followed some old deer trails and cut across some low ridges. I didn't see anyone else. No boot prints, no old fire pits, nothing. I really was out there alone. I liked that. I sat for a long time by the water, just watching dragonflies and the ripple of fish coming up to the surface. It was calm. But that evening, when I got back to camp, something small felt off. I can't explain it in a big, obvious way because nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed, but the air felt heavier, like I wasn't the only one out there anymore. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just getting inside my own head. Being alone for too long can do that. That night, I was lying in my tent, headlamp off, just listening to the sounds outside, when I heard something that didn't quite fit. It was faint, a sort of soft shuffle. Not a four-legged animal sound. Not a deer stepping on twigs, but a steady, slow step, like someone walking carefully. I lay still, holding my breath. It passed by the edge of my camp, maybe 15 or 20 feet away, but I couldn't see anything through the tent wall. I told myself it was probably a big animal, maybe a bear or a moose, but the footsteps stopped for a few seconds. Then I heard them again, this time circling a little wider, then stopping again. The steps were too light for something big like a moose, though. Bears can be quiet, but these steps weren't padding or sniffing around. It sounded like someone slowly walking, stopping, then walking again. I stayed completely still, waiting, listening. After maybe 5 or 6 minutes, the sound faded off into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat up for a long time, listening for more sounds, gripping my knife in my hand inside the tent. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of my camp. I looked for tracks, broken branches, anything. The ground was covered in pine needles and damp leaves, so there wasn't much to see. I didn't find any prints. I convinced myself again that maybe it had been a deer or a porcupine or something else that can sound like footsteps if you don't know better. I've heard stories where people say they swore they heard footsteps, but it turned out to be an animal. I thought about packing up and leaving that day, but part of me didn't want to overreact. I come all this way. I didn't want to ruin the trip just because I got spooked by some sound in the night, so I stayed. I went on another hike, this time following a ridge further out. I didn't see anything unusual, but I also didn't see any signs of other people. No trash, no old wrappers, no fires. Just miles and miles of forest. But when I got back to camp that evening, I noticed something that I couldn't easily brush off. The small pile of firewood I'd gathered the day before was different. Some of the sticks were laid out in a straight line beside the pile. Not all of them, just maybe 5 or 6, but they were lined up neatly, pointing toward my tent. I hadn't done that. I knelt down, staring at them for a long time, thinking maybe I'd done it absent-mindedly. Maybe I'd been arranging sticks while thinking about something else and forgot about it. But the ground around them was undisturbed. No boot prints, no drag marks. I looked around slowly, scanning the tree line, listening. I didn't hear anything except the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. That night, I made a point to build a larger fire. I sat up for hours, just staring into the flames, listening, turning my head at every sound. The usual noises were there: frogs, insects, the occasional crack of branches settling. But then, just past midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Same slow, careful pace, same pauses. It circled wider this time, maybe 30 feet out, but I could hear the pattern clearly. It stopped when I turned my head toward the sound. I stared into the darkness, trying to pick out any movement. My fire was bright enough to cast light about 10 feet out, but beyond that it was just shadows. I didn't see anything. I stood up slowly, my knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other, and I called out. Not with words, just a sharp, loud sound, like a warning bark. Nothing answered. I waited, listening, breathing hard. The steps started again, moving further away, slow and deliberate. Not crashing through the woods, not running, just walking. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat with my back against a tree, staring out into the dark, fire burning low, my flashlight ready. The next morning, I packed up fast. I didn't even cook breakfast. I just wanted to get out. I loaded my gear and started hiking back toward where I'd left my car. About halfway back, maybe half a mile from the car, I found something that made my stomach drop. On the side of the old logging road, just off the path, there was a small pile of sticks. 4 or 5 of them laid out in a straight line, pointing the way I'd just come from. I stopped and stared at them for a long time. They hadn't been there on my hike I was sure of that. I would have noticed something like that, especially because I tend to pay attention to the ground when I walk just out of habit. I scanned the woods again. Silence. No birds, no wind, no movement. I kept walking, faster now, heart pounding. I told myself maybe some other camper or hiker had passed through and left them. Maybe some kid was playing a game. But I hadn't seen anyone else, not in days. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my gear in the back and got in fast. I started the engine, backed up onto the overgrown road, and started driving. I glanced in the rearview mirror several times, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. The whole drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I kept checking the mirror, kept looking out the windows. When I got home, I unpacked, cleaned my gear, and tried to write the trip off as just a strange experience. But the thing that stuck with me wasn't just that it was scary for me. The thing I couldn't stop thinking about was the perspective of whoever or whatever was out there. If it really was a person, then they were alone out there too. They'd probably seen me long before I noticed anything. They were choosing to stay hidden, circling around me, leaving those little signs that they were there. I thought about what it would be like to be that person, alone in the woods, creeping around someone else's camp at night. I mean, yeah, it was terrifying for me, but from their perspective, being alone out there like that, watching someone and making those little silent moves, that's its own kind of terror, isn't it? And that's what still makes my skin crawl. The idea that maybe they were just as afraid of me as I was of them. But instead of walking away, they kept coming back. They kept watching. Maybe that's what scared me the most in the end. The thought that it wasn't just about me being alone out there. It was about someone else being alone too, and making a choice to come closer, to see how far they could go without being seen, without being caught. Maybe they left those sticks on purpose. Maybe they wanted me to know just a little bit. I never went back to that spot. I've camped since then, but only in places where I know there are other people around. I still think about those footsteps, those carefully placed sticks, and the silent shape just outside the firelight. And I still wonder, when I hear a branch crack in the night, am I the only one scared, or is someone else just as afraid of me? I've gone backpacking a lot over the years. I've camped in national parks, state parks, and even way out in the backcountry where you don't see another person for days. I've had trips where nothing went wrong, and I've had trips where we ran into all kinds of problems, bad weather, broken gear, injuries. But this trip sticks in my mind more than any of the others. It wasn't the hardest trip. It wasn't the most dangerous, but it left me feeling more unsettled than any other experience I've had outside. It was the kind of thing that didn't even seem scary while it was happening. It just felt weird. But the more I've thought about it since then, the more it bothers me. It was supposed to be a normal weekend trip. There were 3 of us, me, my friend Brian, and our other buddy Mike. We planned to do a loop trail that covered about 20 miles over 3 days. It was nothing crazy, just a way to get out of town for a bit and spend some time in the woods. We picked a trail that wasn't too popular, but it wasn't completely isolated either. We expected to see some other hikers here and there, but not huge crowds. We started on a Friday morning. The weather was decent at first, gray skies, but no rain. The forecast said there might be storms later in the weekend, but we figured we'd deal with it when it came. We hiked maybe 7 or 8 miles that first day. It was a good stretch of trail, winding through tall pines and open meadows, with the occasional rocky overlook. The trail was in pretty good shape, and we took our time, stopping to snack and take photos here and there. We saw a few other hikers, but no one stayed near us for long. By late afternoon, we found a good campsite. It was a little off the main trail, tucked into a clearing surrounded by trees, with a flat spot for our tents and some big rocks we could use as seats. There was even a fire ring someone had built, though we didn't plan to make a fire. The park had pretty strict fire rules, especially with the weather being so dry. We set up camp, cooked some dinner on our stoves, and settled in for the evening. The clouds started to build while we were eating, and by the time we finished cleaning up, it was clear that a storm was moving in fast. It hit hard. Thunder, lightning, and a heavy downpour. We climbed into our tents around 10 at night. The rain pounded the fabric above us, and the wind shook the trees. I lay awake for a while, listening to the storm, but eventually, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the rain had stopped. The air smelled damp and fresh, like it always does after a storm. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the clearing. The ground was wet, and the sky was still overcast, but the storm had clearly passed. I stretched and looked around. That's when I saw it. There was another tent in the clearing. It wasn't one of ours. It was a small, green one-person tent, set up maybe 20 feet away from us, near the edge of the trees. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. I was sure it hadn't been there the night before. We'd set up our tents in a triangle, with enough space between us but still close enough to feel like a group. This new tent was definitely not part of our group. I thought maybe someone had shown up early in the morning and set up while we were still sleeping. That seemed odd though, because we were pretty far off the main trail, and it had been storming most of the night. Who would hike in that kind of weather, find our site in the dark, and set up in the middle of the night? I saw Brian step out of his tent, and Mike came out a minute later. They saw the new tent too. We didn't say anything, but we all noticed it. We kind of gave each other those silent looks that say, "What the hell?" But no one wanted to make a big deal out of it. After a few minutes, the flap on the stranger's tent opened, and a guy stepped out. He looked like a regular backpacker, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, wearing normal hiking clothes, nothing unusual about him. He nodded at us and started going about his morning, like he was just part of our group. He made himself breakfast, packed up his gear, and joined us as we got ready to hit the trail again. He walked with us like he belonged there. It was strange. I kept trying to think of when he could have arrived. We'd gone to bed around 10, and the storm was already fully going by then. It had been pouring hard, with thunder and wind that didn't let up until early morning. I couldn't imagine anyone hiking in that, let alone bushwhacking off-trail to find our camp and setting up a tent in the mud and rain, in the dark. But somehow that's what must have happened. The thing is, he didn't seem threatening. He didn't do anything that made us feel directly unsafe. He acted like a normal backpacker, but the fact that he'd slipped into our group during the night without us noticing, it stuck with me. It felt like something that should have been impossible, but clearly it wasn't. We hiked all that day, covering another 7 or 8 miles. The guy stayed with us the whole time. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, didn't seem lost. It was like he just decided to join us, like he'd been planning to all along. But we hadn't seen him on the trail the day before, and he hadn't been at our camp when we set up. I kept thinking about how strange the timing was. He would have had to find us in the dark during a storm when there were no other hikers around. And somehow he'd set up his tent without waking us. We stopped for lunch at a small creek, sitting on the rocks and eating energy bars and trail mix. The guy sat with us like he'd been there the whole time. None of us asked where he came from. I think all 3 of us felt the same way. We didn't want to make things awkward. He wasn't doing anything wrong, exactly. It just felt off. That night, we found another campsite, this one near a little ridge that overlooked a valley. The view would have been nice if the sky hadn't still been gray and heavy. We set up our tents again, and so did he. It was like we were a group of 4 now. He set up a little ways from us, but close enough that it was clear he intended to camp with us again. I lay in my tent that night, listening to the wind in the trees. It wasn't storming this time, just quiet and still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I wasn't scared, exactly. It wasn't like he'd done anything that I could point to as dangerous. But there was something about not knowing who he was, where he came from, or how he'd gotten there that unsettled me. I thought about the other hikers we'd seen on the trail. There hadn't been many. No one else seemed to be hiking solo, and we hadn't passed anyone going in the opposite direction who might have been his pace. I didn't remember seeing him behind us the day before either. It was like he'd just appeared. The next morning, we packed up early. The guy packed up too. He walked with us for a few more miles. Then, when we stopped to rest and look at the map, he just kept going. He didn't say goodbye or anything. He just kept walking down the trail and disappeared around a bend. That was the last we saw of him. The rest of the trip was uneventful. We finished the loop and drove home. At first, I didn't think much of it. It just felt like a weird thing that happened. But the more I thought about it later, the more it bothered me. I started going over the details again and again. The storm, the time we went to sleep, how remote our camp was, how we never heard anyone approach, how he set up a tent in the pouring rain without waking any of us. I thought maybe he'd been following us all along, but that didn't make sense either. We hadn't seen him on the trail, and even if he had been behind us, why wait until the worst part of the storm to show up? I thought maybe he'd been camped nearby and just moved over to our site in the middle of the night. But we would have seen another tent nearby when we set up. And why move in the middle of a storm? Most people would have just stayed put. It started to feel like he'd picked us on purpose. Like he'd waited for the storm to cover his arrival. Like he knew exactly when we'd be asleep and how to slip in quietly. Like maybe this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. It wasn't until later that I thought about the risk we'd taken. We'd let this guy stay with us, hike with us, camp with us. We'd shared the trail and the campsites without knowing anything about him. We didn't even know his name. If he'd wanted to hurt us, he could have. If he'd wanted to rob us, we would have been easy targets. We were miles from help, no cell service, no one else around. And we just accepted his presence because he acted like he belonged. That's what sticks with me. How easy it was for him to blend in. How quickly we normalized it. I don't know what his intentions were. Maybe he really was just a friendly backpacker who didn't want to hike alone. Maybe he just thought it was better to camp with a group. Maybe there was nothing sinister about it. But maybe he was testing us, seeing how far he could go without us questioning it, seeing how much he could get away with. I've gone on plenty of trips since then, but I've never let my guard down the same way. I always pay closer attention now. I make a mental note of everyone I see on the trail. I double-check our campsites before we go to sleep. I lock up our food and keep a light nearby. I try to think about things I didn't think about back then. Because the truth is, I don't know who that guy was. I don't know why he chose us. I don't know how he found us in the dark, in the storm, and slipped into our camp without waking us. And I'll probably never know. It wasn't scary, not really, but it was one of the weirdest nights I've ever had while camping. I've gone camping plenty of times, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends or family. But this trip wasn't really planned. It just sort of happened. That's part of what made it feel so random. My brother, his roommate, and I just decided, kind of out of nowhere, to head out into the woods for a night. It was late summer, not too hot, not too cold. One of those weekends where the weather was good, the skies were clear, and none of us had anything going on. We weren't super organized about it. We threw some tents, sleeping bags, a cooler, and a small stove into the back of the truck and left. We didn't even really have a proper destination. We just drove until we found a campground that wasn't too crowded. We didn't go to some far-off wilderness spot. This was one of those Forest Service campgrounds off a paved road, with dirt parking spots and fire pits but no fancy facilities. It wasn't primitive, but it wasn't like some national park campground either. There were no rangers around, no gates, just an honor box for payment and a few scattered campsites. It wasn't packed that weekend, which was nice. A few people were camping nearby, but not right next to us. We set up the tents, built a fire, and cooked some burgers over the flames. It was the kind of camping trip where you don't do much. We didn't bring fishing poles or bikes or anything like that. We just sat around, ate food, had a few drinks, and talked until it got dark. The first part of the night was normal. It was calm and quiet. The air was cool but not too cold, and you could hear the sounds of the forest around us. The occasional owl in the distance, small animals moving through the underbrush, the soft crackling of our fire. It was peaceful. When the fire burned down to embers, we turned in for the night. The three of us were sharing one tent, which was a bit cramped but fine. I fell asleep pretty quickly. It must have been sometime after midnight when I first woke up, but I wasn't really awake yet. It was one of those moments where you know something stirred you, but you don't know what. My brain was foggy, and I wasn't sure if I'd heard something or if I just shifted in my sleep. I lay there in the dark for a bit, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening. That's when I started to notice the noises. At first, I thought maybe it was someone walking back to their camp after using the woods as a bathroom. You hear that sometimes in campgrounds, a few late-night footsteps, the sound of someone fumbling with their tent zipper. But this was different. This wasn't the soft, careful steps of someone trying not to trip over tree roots. It was loud, clumsy, things crashing, sticks snapping, something heavy moving around without any control. The sound came from maybe 50 or 60 feet away. Branches breaking, something slamming against something else, metal or plastic, hard to tell. The noises weren't steady, like footsteps. It was more like something stumbling around and bumping into things. Then there was the yelling. Not words, at least not ones I could understand. Just loud, aggressive yelling that came out in bursts. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't someone calling for help. It was more like someone having a breakdown in the middle of the woods, screaming at nothing. The noises got closer, and that's when I really started to wake up properly. I could feel my heart pick up speed as I lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to this wild, thrashing sound get louder and closer. I didn't say anything. My brother and his roommate were already awake. I could hear their breathing shift, that change in rhythm when you know someone's alert. Nobody moved though. We all just lay there in complete silence, listening. The guy kept banging around, stomping through the woods, tripping over things, knocking into stuff. It wasn't a bear or a deer. It wasn't an animal at all. You could tell from the heavy footsteps, the way things were being thrown, the bursts of human shouting. He was coming closer to our tent, crashing through the brush like he didn't even realize there were other people around. I could hear him breathing hard, labored breathing, and every few seconds he'd shout something out. I still couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't just random sounds. It was like he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. He was close now, really close. I could hear him stomping around just a few feet from the tent. The sound of his shoes crunching the gravel and pine needles was sharp in the silence. I felt this sharp, cold knot form in my stomach. I remember lying there thinking, what does this guy want? Is he just high out of his mind? Is he looking for someone? Is he dangerous? My brother's roommate shifted in his sleeping bag, quietly but deliberately. I could hear the faint sound of a zipper and some small clicks. He'd brought his pistol with him. A legal carry, nothing fancy, and I realized he was reaching for it now. I didn't move. I just kept listening. The guy outside the tent kept pacing, stomping in circles, shouting randomly. At one point he kicked something, maybe a log or a cooler, and it slammed loudly into something else. It sounded like he might have thrown it. For a second, I thought he was going to rip open the tent. I imagined the zipper flying up, this guy's face suddenly there, inches from mine. But that didn't happen. Instead, I heard him mumble something that actually made sense for the first time. He was talking about the pole. He said the word over and over, like he was focused on it. Then there was silence. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then I heard sirens, distant but getting closer. They weren't blasting, just that low, controlled whoop that police sometimes use when they're trying to find a specific spot without alarming everyone around. Took me a second to realize what that meant. Someone must have called them. Maybe another camper had heard the yelling and called it in. The guy outside didn't seem to notice at first. He just kept stomping around. But the sirens got closer and eventually stopped, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. I heard car doors slam, quick footsteps, and then clear voices, sharp and firm, moving fast. They were yelling at him now. Their words were clear, but the guy wasn't responding. Suddenly, there was a pop, probably a taser, then another one, and I heard him hit the ground hard, face first into the dirt. There were more loud commands, more shuffling, and the situation seemed to calm down after that. I could hear the police securing the guy, handcuffing him, getting things under control. None of us moved for a while. We just lay there in the tent, waiting for the noise to fully stop. Eventually, the cops must have walked the guy back to their vehicle because the sounds faded. The whole thing was over in maybe 10 minutes, but it felt longer. The sirens didn't blast again. They just quietly drove off, no big scene, no flashing lights. In the morning, we all got up around the same time. None of us had really slept well after that. There wasn't much left to clean up. We hadn't made a fire or unpacked much the night before. We stood around for a few minutes, looking at the trampled ground near the tent. You could see where the guy had walked back and forth, stomping and kicking things. We even found the pole he'd been carrying. It was a busted tent pole from someone else's camp, cracked in the middle. It wasn't even a weapon, just a random broken thing he'd picked up and started swinging around like it mattered. We chuckled about it, not because it was funny in a haha way, but because it was so absurd. Out of all the things that could have happened on a random, last-minute camping trip, getting woken up by some high guy screaming about a pole and then hearing the police taser him right outside our tent was not something any of us would have predicted. It wasn't scary in the traditional sense. It wasn't life-threatening, but it stuck with me because it was so unexpected. You always think about bears or getting lost or maybe even other campers causing trouble, but this was different. This was just one of those weird, messy moments where life throws something completely random at you. And even now, when I think back on that night, I can picture the sounds more than anything else. The chaotic stomping, the random shouts, the crunch of footsteps circling our tent, the soft click of a pistol being cocked in the dark, the sharp commands from the police, and the thud of the guy hitting the ground after the taser hit him. The woods are strange like that. You expect quiet nights, stars, the crackle of a campfire. But sometimes you get something else. Sometimes you get a man high out of his mind, swinging a broken tent pole, wandering from site to site, not even realizing how close he is to people trying to sleep. We packed up and left that morning, still talking about it as we loaded the truck. By the time we hit the main road, it was already turning into one of those stories we'd tell other people later. One of those weird camping memories that sticks in your head not because it was terrifying, but because it was just so strangely real. Not a ghost story, not a monster in the woods, just a wild, loud, confused man who wandered into our night and left almost as fast as he came. It was weird as hell, but we laughed about it on the way home, and even now, I can't help but laugh a little every time I think about it. My uncle has always been the type to spend his weekends out in the desert. Dirt bikes, trailers, fires, and long open spaces, that's where he feels at home. He and his buddies had a habit of heading out to the same stretch of desert a few times every year. There wasn't much out there, just dirt, rocks, sagebrush, and miles of space. The nearest town was about a 30-minute drive, and most of the camps would set up several miles apart from each other for privacy. Out there, you could ride dirt bikes for hours without seeing another person. This particular trip happened a few years back. My uncle told me the whole thing in a way where you could tell he wasn't trying to scare me, but you could also see that it stuck with him. It wasn't some campfire ghost story or anything made up. It was just something that genuinely unsettled him, even though it all made sense by the time it was over. It was a typical setup for them. They drove out into the desert on a Friday afternoon, pulling a big enclosed trailer with a couple of dirt bikes strapped inside. They parked in one of their usual spots, flat ground, open space, far from the next group of campers. The desert was wide open, and when you're out there, you can see for a long way in every direction. They always picked spots like that so they wouldn't bother anyone and so no one would bother them. There were 4 of them on this trip. They set up the trailer, unfolded some camp chairs, started a fire, and spent the evening drinking beers and swapping stories. They rode for most of the day Saturday, doing loops around the area, cutting through trails and finding old dirt roads. Out in the desert, the only tracks you see are your own unless someone else comes through, and usually you can tell if other people have been around by the fresh tire marks. That's something they always paid attention to, partly out of habit and partly for safety. You don't want to ride into someone else's camp or cross paths unexpectedly. But this time, they hadn't seen anyone ride through their area all day. Saturday night was like most nights out there. They built another fire, cooked up some simple food, hot dogs and beans, that sort of thing, and sat around the fire until late. There's a particular quiet that settles over the desert at night. Once the fire dies down and the wind calms, it's just you, the cold air, and the sound of the dirt crunching under your boots. They put the fire out with dirt and some leftover water before heading into the trailer to sleep. They didn't think much about it. Out there, things are usually predictable. It was early the next morning, just as the sky was starting to brighten but before the sun was fully up. My uncle got up before the rest of them. He likes to get the generator going first thing so there's power for coffee and lights. He stepped outside the trailer, walked a few steps toward the generator, and then stopped. Sitting there in one of their folding camp chairs, right next to the fire pit, was a man. My uncle said it took him a few seconds to process what he was seeing. The fire pit was smoldering lightly, some gray ash with a bit of smoke coming off it. They'd fully put it out the night before, but that was normal. It's hard to smother every ember. But this man, this stranger, was just sitting there. His head was drooped forward, elbows on his knees, like he'd fallen asleep right there in the chair. The first thing my uncle did was look around the area. Out there, it's wide open, so you can see for hundreds of yards in every direction. He scanned the nearby dirt trails, the flat scrubland, looking for a vehicle, a bike, an ATV. Anything that could have brought this man to their camp. There was nothing, not even fresh tire tracks besides their own. The next camp was at least a mile away. Even at that distance, you'd usually hear the low rumble of engines or see the glint of a windshield in the morning light. But there was nothing, just this guy sitting quietly in one of their chairs. My uncle felt uneasy. He said it was one of the rare moments where things just didn't make sense. A guy doesn't just appear out in the desert with no ride. But the man didn't look aggressive or threatening, just completely out of it. He wasn't moving much, just kind of slumped in the chair like he was dead asleep. So my uncle went back inside the trailer and woke up the other guys. They all came out, now curious and a little on edge. They didn't know if this guy was sick, high, dangerous, or maybe just someone who got turned around during the night. They walked over, making enough noise to wake him up. Eventually, the man stirred. He looked groggy, confused, and disoriented. He rubbed his face and sat up a little straighter. My uncle said it was clear the guy had been drinking heavily. His clothes were dusty, his face was sunburned, and his eyes were glassy. He wasn't making much sense at first, but once he got his bearings, he motioned in the direction of another camp and indicated he needed a ride. They could tell he wasn't dangerous, just probably embarrassed and dehydrated. One of the guys agreed to drive him. My uncle came along just to be safe, and they helped the man into the truck. The guy seemed too out of it to offer much explanation, but he pointed roughly where he thought his camp was. They drove about 3 miles across the dirt roads until they reached another large campsite. It was more crowded, with several RVs and trucks parked in a loose circle. They saw a few people standing around, and among them were a couple of state troopers. As they pulled up, the scene started to make sense. The troopers and the people at the camp immediately recognized the man and came over. Apparently, the man had been drinking heavily the night before at their camp. Somewhere during the night, in his drunk state, he'd taken one of their golf carts and driven off into the desert. The others at his camp hadn't realized he was gone until the morning, and they'd contacted the troopers when they found the golf cart missing. The man had driven the golf cart until it ran out of gas in the middle of nowhere. From there, he must have just started walking aimlessly through the desert until he stumbled across my uncle's camp. The crazy part was that he walked several miles through the cold desert night, in the dark, with no light, no supplies, no real sense of direction, and just happened to come across their trailer. Out there, you can walk in any direction for hours and not hit anything. The chances of him wandering straight into their camp like that were strange, almost like dumb luck. When they put it all together, it made sense, but it still sat weird with my uncle. He kept thinking about how he found the guy sitting there, silently, in their chair, with no sound of him arriving, no vehicle in sight, just sitting there while the last bits of their fire smoldered. The troopers thanked my uncle and his friend for bringing the man back safely. They explained that the man had been drinking heavily all weekend and that this wasn't the first time he'd done something reckless while drunk. They seemed relieved to have him back in one piece, and it didn't sound like they were going to press charges over the stolen golf cart since it belonged to someone in his group. After leaving the man with his people, my uncle and his friend drove back to their own camp. They were quiet on the drive. It wasn't like they were scared exactly, it just left them with an odd feeling. They couldn't shake how unlikely it all was, how the guy could have ended up anywhere but somehow found them. Back at camp, they told the others what had happened. They spent the rest of the day riding, but the whole time, my uncle said he kept thinking about how easy it would have been for things to go wrong. The man could have wandered the other direction and collapsed somewhere in the open desert. If he'd passed out there, it would have been hard for anyone to find him in time, especially in the morning heat. What stuck with my uncle the most was how normal the whole thing seemed on the surface. A drunk guy getting lost, a random ride back to his camp, but when you break it down, it was a perfect chain of things that had to line up just right. If they'd camped a little further away, if they'd picked another spot, if the guy had walked left instead of right, if the fire hadn't smoldered and drawn his attention, any small detail could have changed the outcome. The desert is huge, and most of it looks the same. There are no landmarks, no clear paths at night. The man's chance of stumbling across their specific camp in that wide-open desert, with no light and no sense of where he was unbelievably low. But it happened. The rest of their trip was uneventful, but the story stayed with my uncle. Not because it was terrifying, not because anything bad happened, but because it reminded him how easily something can tip into disaster out there. The desert can swallow people. No supernatural story needed, it's just a place where, if you're not careful, you can vanish without anyone knowing where you went. The man was lucky. He probably didn't even understand how lucky he was. He wandered in the dark, sat down at a stranger's camp, and they happened to be the kind of people who helped him instead of chasing him off. He got a ride back. He got to go home, but it could have been a very different ending. My uncle still thinks about that sometimes when he's out in the desert, sitting by the fire, staring into the dark. Out there, it doesn't take much to get lost, and sometimes people just appear out of nowhere. I spend a lot of my time camping alone. It's the kind of life I've always liked. Quiet, simple, not much noise, not many people. I have a small camper that's easy to move, and I usually stick to quiet places. I like the smaller campgrounds, the ones that aren't listed in the big directories, the ones you find by accident when you turn off the main road and just follow a dusty path. I don't look for big cities or fancy setups. I like dirt roads, thick trees, wide open spaces. I like to park somewhere I can breathe. I don't need a lot of entertainment. Sometimes I fish, sometimes I hike, but mostly I just enjoy being outside, being away from everything. I like walking at night, especially in quiet parks when most people are asleep. There's something about those dark walks that feels good. Everything slows down. There's no traffic noise, no people talking, no music or crowds. Just the sound of my boots on gravel or dirt. Maybe the soft rustle of leaves when the wind moves through the trees. I was in Florida when this happened, somewhere a little north of Daytona. It wasn't a big event weekend or anything, just a regular stop for me on my slow crawl around the state. The campground was small, maybe 15 or 20 spots, spread out enough that you didn't have neighbors right on top of you. The roads inside the park weren't paved, just packed dirt with some grass pushing through in places. There were a few tall pines scattered around and some thick brush at the edges. I'd been there for a couple of days, enjoying the quiet. There were only a few other campers in the park, mostly older folks who stayed inside their RVs in the evenings watching TV or listening to quiet radio. I didn't hear much coming from them, just the faint sound of a generator every now and then. That night, I'd finished making a simple dinner and decided to take one of my usual late walks. I didn't bring a flashlight because the moon was bright enough to see where I was going, and I liked the natural light. There were no streetlights in the park, no extra lights outside the campers. Just the soft glow of a few windows here and there, and the moonlight laying out the roads like a pale ribbon. I didn't walk fast. I took my time, stepping carefully so I wouldn't trip over any rocks or roots. The dirt road curved around the park in a loose circle, and I just followed it, listening to the sounds of the night. I could hear crickets, the faint buzz of insects in the grass, the soft crackle of something moving in the brush. Probably raccoons or armadillos, things I was used to hearing. The air was cool but not cold, and I could smell the dampness of the grass mixed with the faint hint of pine. It was the kind of night where you just walk without thinking, letting your feet carry you around while your mind drifts. I'd made it about halfway around the loop when I saw something. It was low to the ground, pale in color, sitting perfectly still just off the side of the road, maybe 15 feet away. It wasn't near any camper, and it wasn't under any light. It was sitting close to the grass, right where the road met the edge of the brush. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a rock, maybe a piece of trash. It didn't really look like anything specific, just a pale, low shape. I kept walking, not in a hurry, but as I got closer, something about it caught my attention. It wasn't shaped like a bag or a box. It had a rounded, uneven shape to it, almost like a crouched figure. But it didn't move. It didn't shift, it didn't flinch when I walked closer, and it didn't make a sound. It just sat there, completely still. I stopped walking, just for a second, to get a better look. The moonlight wasn't strong enough to give me every detail, but I could see that it wasn't trash. It wasn't a rock. It was too smooth for that, too rounded in the wrong places. I squinted, leaning forward a little, trying to make sense of it. Then it moved. Not a sudden movement, not a jump or a sprint. It just slowly crawled forward, staying low to the ground, dragging itself at a steady, careful pace. It wasn't fast, but it was moving with purpose, like it knew exactly where it wanted to go. I could see now that it was a person, someone crawling on their hands and knees, moving deliberately across the ground, staying low as if they didn't want to be seen. I felt that cold knot form in my stomach. The first thing that crossed my mind was maybe they were hurt. Maybe someone had fallen and was trying to get help. But as I watched, I realized they weren't struggling. Their crawl was too smooth, too steady. They weren't dragging a broken leg or limping along. They were moving like someone who wanted to stay close to the dirt, moving like it was on purpose. I stood there frozen, watching as this figure, this man, crawled silently across the edge of the road and slipped into the brush on the other side. There was no sound, no snapping twigs, no heavy breathing, no grunt of effort. Just the quiet shuffle of fabric brushing against the dirt. I don't know how long I stood there after he disappeared into the brush. Maybe a minute, maybe two. My heart was beating faster now, not quite panic, but a sharp edge of alertness, like my body was telling me to wake up and pay attention. I slowly turned and walked the other way, moving steadily back toward my camper. I didn't run. I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. When I got back, I locked the door, pulled the blinds, and sat down to think. Who was that? Why were they crawling? It wasn't normal. It wasn't a guy who tripped and fell and was trying to get up. It was someone intentionally moving low to the ground in the dark, staying quiet, staying hidden. The thing that bothered me the most was how comfortable he seemed doing it. Like this wasn't the first time he'd crawled around a campground at night. Like he knew how to move silently, how to stay in the blind spots where people wouldn't notice. I didn't hear any footsteps after that. I didn't hear any car engines starting. The night stayed quiet. I stayed awake most of the night just listening. Every little rustle outside put me on edge. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was alert, wide awake, waiting for any sign that the crawler was near. Nothing happened. In the morning, I went back to the spot where I'd seen him. I checked the edge of the road, the brush, the grass. I could see faint marks where something had moved through. Flattened grass, disturbed dirt, but nothing else. No bags, no gear, no sign that anyone had been camping out there. I stayed one more night, mostly because I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't spooked. But I didn't go out walking that night. I stayed in my camper with the door locked, blinds shut, everything quiet. When I left the next day, I kept thinking about it. I've been to a lot of campgrounds over the years. I've seen all kinds of people, from families with loud kids to old men who sit by the fire all day. But I'd never seen anyone crawling around at night like that. Not walking, not standing, crawling. The way he moved, it wasn't panicked, it wasn't confused. It was smooth, controlled, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Like maybe this was something he'd done before. I still wonder what his reason was. Maybe he was trying to sneak up on other campers. Maybe he was looking for things to steal. Maybe he just liked crawling around at night. I'll never know. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a man, low to the ground, moving carefully, silently, in a way that didn't feel right. Since then, I've changed a few things about how I camp. I still travel alone, still park in quiet places, but I always lock up now, even if I'm just stepping away for a few minutes. I bring a flashlight on every walk, no matter how bright the moon is, and I always keep my head on a swivel. I don't just watch for the obvious things. I watch the ground, the brush, the spaces low to the dirt where you wouldn't normally expect someone to be. I've come to accept that not every danger comes walking tall. Some of them crawl. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not looking down, you might miss them completely until they're too close. That night changed how I see the dark. It's not just what's out in the open. It's what's moving quietly, low to the ground, staying just out of the corner of your eye. I think about George sometimes. I don't know his real name. I don't know if anyone does. But I gave him that name in my head, George. Just a man enjoying his nighttime crawl. Nothing weird, nothing creepy, unless you happen to notice him. And I did. And I moved on. But I always remember to look now, low to the ground. I've always trusted my gut. That deep, sharp feeling that hits you out of nowhere and makes your skin tighten and your stomach twist. I work in a job where I need to. I won't get into the details, but part of my work means I often deal with people who are in dangerous or unpredictable situations. People trying to hurt themselves or sometimes trying to hurt others. Over time, you start to understand the difference between normal, routine danger and something else. Something that doesn't fit. I've been in situations where everything seems okay on the surface, but something just feels wrong. In those moments, the hair on the back of my neck stands up, my heartbeat changes, my breathing gets shallow. It's not something you can explain to anyone else. It just happens. And in my experience, that feeling has always been right. I didn't think I'd feel it when I went camping alone. It was the early fall, cool but not cold. I had a few days off and wanted to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I was starting to feel worn down. I thought getting into the woods, away from people, away from everything, would help. I'd gone camping alone before, and I liked the quiet. I picked a spot I'd been to once with some friends a few years back. It was far enough off the main trail that I wouldn't expect to see anyone else, but not so remote that it would be unsafe. There was a small clearing next to a slow-moving creek. I liked that spot. The trees formed a loose circle around it, with just enough space to set up a tent and have a fire without feeling boxed in. I parked my truck at the trailhead and hiked in with my pack. The hike was about 5 miles in, just a steady walk through the woods. The leaves were starting to turn, so everything had that golden, late-season look. I didn't see anyone else on the trail. By the time I reached the clearing, it was late afternoon. I took my time setting up camp. I put my tent up on the flattest ground I could find, close to the creek but not so close that the ground would get soggy. I gathered wood, built a fire ring with some rocks, and made sure I had everything where I wanted it. It was peaceful. The sound of the creek, the wind moving through the leaves, the distant rustling of animals that didn't care I was there. It all made me feel calm. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire and ate while the sun dropped behind the trees. It gets dark fast in the woods. 1 minute you're in the warm orange light, and the next you're surrounded by a deep, heavy blue. I sat by the fire for a while after eating, just listening. I remember thinking how good it felt to be away from everything. No phones, no noise, no work. Eventually, I put the fire out and crawled into my tent. I had a good sleeping bag and a foam pad, so I was comfortable. I remember laying there in the dark, hearing the slow gurgle of the creek and the soft creaks of the trees as they moved. I drifted off easily. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the first thing I noticed was that I was wide awake. Not groggy, not confused, just fully alert, like someone had snapped their fingers in my face. I was staring at the dark ceiling of my tent, and I had this sharp, cold feeling in my chest. My body was already tense. My breathing was already slow and shallow. I felt that before many times at work. It's the kind of thing you can't force yourself to feel. It either happens or it doesn't. And when it does, you better pay attention. I lay there perfectly still, listening. I didn't hear anything at first, just the usual night sounds. The creek, the leaves, the small animals moving through the brush. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger. I felt like something was wrong, but I didn't know what. Then I heard it. Something moving. The sound was faint, but clear. A steady crunch of dry leaves. It wasn't the random rustling of a squirrel or a raccoon. It was too slow, too deliberate. It would move a few steps, then stop. Move a few more steps, then stop again. I was fully awake now, my body frozen, every muscle tight. I kept telling myself it was probably a deer, maybe a coyote. Animals come through campsites all the time, but something didn't fit. The footsteps didn't sound like the four-legged shuffle of a deer. They sounded heavier, more like a person walking carefully. The steps circled my campsite slowly, always stopping after a few paces. I stayed silent, my ears straining to catch every sound. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but something inside me told me not to. I've trusted that instinct before. It saved me more than once. So I stayed in the tent, listening. The footsteps came closer. I could hear them on both sides of me now, like whatever it was moving in wide circles, stepping over sticks and leaves. And then they stopped, completely. I waited. Nothing. Just the sound of the creek. Minutes passed, but the feeling in my gut didn't go away. It just got sharper, colder. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew I couldn't just sit up and unzip the tent like nothing was happening. If there was someone out there, I didn't want to make myself a target. I slowly, quietly, moved my hand to the side pocket of my sleeping bag and pulled out the small knife I always keep close when I camp. It wasn't much, but it was something. I sat there, breathing as softly as I could, holding the knife close to my chest. I thought about what I should do. Should I make noise? Should I wait? Should I try to sneak out and run? Every option felt dangerous. I didn't have any real cover, just trees and bushes. If someone wanted to mess with me out here, I'd have no chance in the open. Then I heard a new sound. It was quick, sharp, just outside the tent. A soft tapping, like a fingertip brushing the fabric. Tap, tap, came from the back of the tent. Then silence. I stayed completely still, my breathing locked, my body tense. Then another tap from the other side, like something was circling me, testing the tent. Tapped again, closer to where my head was. I gripped the knife harder, feeling the sweat build in my palm. Then silence again. Long, deep silence. Minutes passed. Maybe more than minutes, it felt like forever. I didn't hear any more footsteps. I didn't hear anything at all, except the soft, constant sound of the creek. I sat there like that until the sky started to lighten. The first gray hints of dawn seeped through the thin fabric of the tent. When I was sure there was enough light to see, I slowly unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. The campsite was empty. The ground around the tent was littered with dry leaves and twigs, but I could clearly see a line of disturbed leaves, places where something or someone had walked, circling the tent. The tracks weren't sharp like shoe prints, but I could see where the leaves had been pushed aside, where the ground had been pressed down. I got up and looked around, checking the trees, the bushes, the edge of the creek. Nothing. No one. I didn't waste time. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my pack in a rush. I kept the knife in my hand the whole time. My gut was still tight, that cold knot still sitting there. I didn't feel safe even with the daylight. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every sound in the woods made me jump. Every bird, every rustle of the wind, every crack of a twig felt sharp, close, like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But I didn't see anyone. When I got back to my truck, I locked the doors immediately and sat there for a long time, just breathing, waiting for that knot in my gut to ease up. It never fully did. Even now, thinking back, I don't know who or what it was that circled my tent that night. Could have been an animal, but it didn't move like an animal. Could have been a person, but if it was, why didn't they try to rob me or attack me? Why just tap on the tent and leave? Was it someone just trying to scare me? Was it someone passing through? Or was it someone who changed their mind at the last second? I don't know. I'll never know. But I do know this. The feeling I had that night was the same one I've had at work when I've been face to face with someone truly dangerous. That sharp, cold, gut feeling. And that feeling has never lied to me before. Since that trip, I've only camped alone a few times, and never in that same spot. I still like the woods, but I pay attention to my instincts now more than ever. When the hair stands up on the back of my neck, when my gut tightens, when that cold knot shows up in my chest, I trust it. I don't question it. Because out there, sometimes the only warning you get is that feeling. And sometimes that's the only thing that keeps you safe. I used to think camping was something you could always control. You pack your gear, you plan your trip, you look at the weather, and you just go. You bring food, water, a tent, and maybe a good pocket knife. You stay on the trails, you set up in safe spots, and you lock your food away from animals. It all seemed like something with steps and rules, and if you followed them, everything would be fine. I wasn't really much of a social camper. I didn't like going in groups or being the one that had to babysit friends who didn't know what they were doing. I liked going alone, honestly. There was something peaceful about getting away from everyone and just spending a few days out in the woods with no one talking to you, no one texting you, no one needing anything. I always thought I was being careful. I always thought I was being smart. I always thought nothing could happen to me out there because I wasn't the kind of person who made stupid mistakes. I wasn't careless. I didn't wander off trails or get drunk around a campfire. I thought I was safe. But it's funny how quickly that idea can come apart. It was late summer when I went out that time. I'd been reading random camping threads online a lot, just scrolling through stories people would post about weird things they'd seen or heard in the woods. Most of them didn't bother me. In fact, I kind of liked reading them right before bed. There was something about laying in the dark with just my phone light, scrolling through those stories, and reading the comments where people would say things like, "I just love reading comments like this when I'm laying in bed in the dark. LOL." I used to think, yeah, me too, like I was in on some fun little creepy game. But it's not a game when you're the one who has to live through it. I went out to a national forest that was about 4 hours from where I lived. I'd been there before, so I knew some of the less popular trails that still had good places to set up camp, but were far enough away from the busy areas that I wouldn't see many people. I wanted that. I wanted to just be alone. The trailhead was empty when I got there. I parked my car, checked my pack, adjusted my boots, and started walking. It was warm but not hot, just that kind of summer day where you can still wear jeans without sweating. The forest was thick and green, and the trail was a little overgrown in spots but still easy to follow. I didn't pass anyone on the trail. I didn't hear anyone either. Just the wind moving the trees around and birds somewhere up high, calling to each other. I hiked about 6 miles into a clearing I'd used before. It was flat and had enough open sky to see the stars at night, but it was ringed by trees on all sides, so it felt tucked away. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and made a simple dinner. Just dehydrated rice and chicken. I ate sitting on a log, looking out at the trees, feeling like I'd found the exact quiet I'd been wanting. After dinner, I cleaned everything up. I kept my bear canister about 100 feet away from camp, tucked in the bushes where I could see it from my tent. I didn't see or hear any animals nearby, but I didn't want to take chances. When it got dark, I sat by the fire for a while and just listened. Sometimes it's almost like the forest changes when the sun goes down. All the daytime sounds, birds, bugs, leaves shifting, they sort of settle down and the night sounds take over. Crickets, owls, the occasional thump in the distance that's probably a raccoon or deer. It was quiet that night, quieter than I expected. It didn't bother me though. I kind of liked that kind of quiet. I didn't need to hear animals to feel safe. I climbed into my tent sometime around 10. I brought a book, but I didn't feel like reading. I just laid there, scrolling on my phone for a bit, even though I knew I wouldn't have any signal. I'd saved some pages ahead of time, threads of camping stories, weird experiences people posted about. I was reading one about a guy who heard footsteps around his tent at night but never saw anyone. The top comment was something like, "I just love reading comments like this when I'm laying in bed in the dark. LOL. I smirked when I read it. I thought, yeah, me too. Then I put my phone down and closed my eyes. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was the kind of waking where you know something pulled you out of sleep. It wasn't that you just rolled over or had a dream. You heard something, and your brain snapped you awake before you could even process it. I laid there perfectly still, listening. It was dead quiet outside. No wind, no bugs, no night birds. Just the kind of silence where you can hear the faint buzz of your own ears. Then I heard it. A sound like a single, slow step on dry leaves. Close, very close, like within 20 feet of my tent. I stayed frozen, my breathing shallow, trying to listen. I told myself it was probably just a deer walking through. Maybe it had come to sniff around camp. But I didn't hear any other steps. Just that one, like something had paused mid-movement. I sat up slowly and carefully in my sleeping bag. I didn't turn on my headlamp because I didn't want to light myself up like a target. I unzipped the sleeping bag quietly and pressed my ear to the tent wall. Another step. Crunch. But this time it was behind my tent, a little to the side. Not running, not walking, just one slow step. Waiting. Then another one, closer. The hairs on my arms lifted. This wasn't the way animals usually moved. Deer don't step like that. They walk continuously or bound away. This was someone, circling my tent carefully, deliberately. I didn't move. I just sat there, listening, trying to keep my breathing under control. Another step. Same slow, crunching sound. It was looping around me. I sat there for probably 5 or 10 minutes, listening to the steps move around the tent, then stop, then move again. Sometimes I'd hear nothing for a minute or two, like whoever it was standing perfectly still, listening for me. I knew I had to get a look outside. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I couldn't just sit there all night, blind. I slid my hand slowly over to the tent zipper, took a breath, and in one quick motion, I unzipped it just enough to peek through. It was almost pitch black outside. There was a sliver of moon, but the trees blocked most of it. I waited for my eyes to adjust. Then I saw it. Not an animal, not a raccoon or a deer or anything like that. It was a person, standing maybe 15 feet away. They weren't moving, just standing there, angled slightly so I could see the side of their face. I could just barely make out that they were wearing dark clothes, but I couldn't see anything else about them. They weren't holding a flashlight. They weren't saying anything. They were just standing there as quiet as they could be. I pulled my head back inside the tent, zipped it up silently, and sat there shaking. What the hell was I supposed to do? Yell? Run? Stay still? I didn't know. I didn't have a gun. I had a small knife, but that didn't feel like much in that moment. I thought maybe if I made some noise, if I showed I wasn't asleep, maybe they'd get spooked and leave. But something told me that this person wasn't just a random hiker. They hadn't stumbled into my camp by accident. They weren't making noise or asking for help. They were circling my tent deliberately and quietly, like they were trying not to wake me. That terrified me more than anything. I reached for my bear horn. It's one of those compressed air horns meant to scare animals away. I always kept it next to my sleeping bag. I waited until I heard the next step, a crunch directly behind my tent. I blasted the horn. The sound ripped through the silence, echoing hard off the trees. I kept blasting it 3 or 4 short, sharp bursts. When I stopped, I listened. I heard footsteps this time. Fast, crashing footsteps moving away through the underbrush. Whoever it was didn't wait around after that. I kept the horn in my hand, shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I didn't know if they'd come back. I didn't know if they were alone. I didn't know if they'd left something behind, like a marker or a trap. I sat there until sunrise, wide awake, gripping the horn, listening to every tiny sound outside. As soon as there was enough daylight, I packed up. I didn't even make breakfast. I just shoved everything into my bag and started hiking back as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every snap of a branch, every bird flapping its wings, it all made me spin around, expecting to see someone there. But I didn't see anyone on the way out. The trail was still empty. My car was untouched. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I replayed it over and over, wondering if I'd done the right thing, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't had the horn, if I'd waited too long. I went back to those camping threads online, the ones where people tell their weird stories and creepy experiences. And sure enough, I found another one. Someone describing the sound of footsteps around their tent at night. And the top comment? I just love reading comments like this when I'm laying in bed in the dark. LOL. But now I don't laugh at comments like that anymore. I don't scroll through those threads like they're fun stories to tell by a fire, because I know what it feels like to be the story. To sit in the dark, in a nylon tent, listening to someone move around you with quiet, careful steps. I know what it feels like when the story's not something you're reading anymore. It's something you're living. And when you're living it, there's no screen to hide behind. No light from your phone to keep you company. Just you and whatever's waiting outside. Started as a solo camping trip, something I had wanted to do for a long time. I wanted to clear my head, be away from my phone, and just spend time in the woods, alone. I picked a quiet area in a national forest, about a 3-hour drive from home. I did my research. It wasn't a popular spot, which I liked. I wanted to be alone. There was a long dirt road leading in, and not many campsites, mostly just open forest with no marked spots. I didn't even pass another car when I drove in. I packed my backpack carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a good knife, a map, a compass, and a first aid kit. I wasn't stupid. I knew the woods could be dangerous, but I trusted myself. I was used to hiking, and I had done plenty of overnight trips before, but this was my first time being out by myself for more than a night. The first day was quiet. I set up camp next to a small stream. I boiled some water, made some simple food, and explored the nearby area a little. There were no other tents, no other people, no signs that anyone had been around for a while. The ground was undisturbed, the trails were faint, and it felt like no one had walked there in a long time. That first night was peaceful. I heard the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, the wind moving through the trees, the occasional rustle of small animals. I slept well. The next morning, I went on a longer hike away from my camp. I walked for hours, following deer trails and taking my time. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I hadn't seen another person since I parked my car. No boot prints on the trails, no fresh bike tracks, no trash left behind. I loved the feeling of being completely alone, but there was also something about it that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I told myself that was normal, just nerves from being alone. I had my GPS watch with me. I marked my starting point and my camp to make sure I wouldn't get lost. Around midday, I sat down to eat a granola bar on a large rock near the edge of a small clearing. As I sat there, I noticed something that seemed out of place. A pair of shoes. Not hiking boots, not trail runners. Just old, dirty sneakers sitting side by side in the grass. like someone had taken them off carefully and left them there. They didn't look new, but they also didn't look like they had been sitting there for years. No moss, no dirt stuffed inside. They looked like they had maybe been there a few days. I stared at them for a while. It was strange, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone came through, took a rest, swapped their shoes for boots, and forgot to pick them up on the way out. Weird, but not impossible. Still, something about them bothered me. They weren't left in a careless way, like someone just tossed them. They were sitting neatly, side by side, toes pointing toward the woods. I walked over and looked at them closer. There was nothing else. No backpack, no trash, no signs anyone had been there. The grass was a little pressed down around them, but there weren't fresh footprints, at least none I could see. I didn't touch them. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. It was dead silent except for the breeze. I kept moving after that, but I couldn't get the image of those shoes out of my head. They didn't make sense. The forest was huge, and maybe I was overthinking it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had put them there on purpose. I finished my loop and got back to camp in the late afternoon. I ate dinner early and decided I'd pack up and leave in the morning instead of staying the full 3 days. Something didn't feel right, and I've learned to trust that feeling. That night, I built a small fire and sat beside it, trying to enjoy the last bit of quiet before heading home. The woods felt different now. They didn't feel peaceful. They felt like they were holding their breath. I went to bed early but didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening to the silence. Around midnight, I thought I heard something moving outside my tent. It wasn't close, but it was something large, too big to be a rabbit or a raccoon. It wasn't a steady movement like walking. It was more like something stepping, stopping, then stepping again. I lay completely still, holding my breath, listening. It went on for maybe 5 minutes, and then it was quiet again. I didn't hear it walk away. It just stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun started to rise, I packed everything up quickly. I stuffed my tent into my pack without rolling it properly, just crammed it in and started hiking back toward my car. I followed the same path I came in on. It was about a 3-hour walk back to where I'd parked. I felt better once I was moving. I kept checking behind me, but I didn't see anything, just woods. About halfway back, I came across another strange thing. It was a pile of clothes, not shoes this time, pants, a t-shirt, and a jacket, all folded neatly on a log right beside the trail, like someone had taken them off and left them there. Again, they didn't look like they'd been sitting there for long. The fabric wasn't soaked from dew. No leaves stuck to them, no signs of animals tearing at them. Just clean, folded clothes in the middle of nowhere. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't normal. People don't just leave clothes in the woods, folded like that. I looked around carefully. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything. I forced myself to keep walking, faster now. Another hour passed. I kept looking behind me, kept feeling like I was being watched. Every squirrel that darted through the leaves made me flinch. The forest felt wrong. I didn't know how else to put it. It was like I had walked into someone else's territory. I was about 15 minutes from my car when I saw it. Another pair of shoes. This time they were newer. Trail runners, probably worth a good amount of money, just sitting there in the middle of the trail, facing the direction I was walking. Just like the first pair, they were placed neatly side by side. They hadn't been there when I came in. I was sure of that. I stopped, my heart thudding hard in my chest. I scanned the woods slowly, but everything was still. The air felt heavy. I kept walking faster now. I didn't stop to look at the shoes. I just passed them and kept going. When I reached the parking area, I saw my car right where I left it, alone in the clearing. But I also saw something else. A plastic water bottle, sitting on the ground right next to the driver's side door. It wasn't mine. I hadn't left anything outside the car. I was sure of it. The bottle was nearly full, clear, like it had just been placed there. It wasn't dusty. It wasn't dirty. It was like someone had left it for me. I stood there staring at it, breathing hard. I looked around the clearing, at the tree line, at the long dirt road leading back to the main highway. No other cars, no sounds, just the same dead silence. I didn't touch the bottle. I walked around to the passenger side, got in, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I backed out of the clearing and sped down the dirt road, heart hammering the whole time. As I drove, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But I never did. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I don't know what was going on out there. I don't know if someone was playing some strange game, or if I stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. Maybe I crossed paths with someone who didn't want me there. Maybe the shoes and the clothes were warnings or signs for someone else. Maybe I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I haven't been camping alone since then. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the shoes, about the way they were placed, about the bottle left by my car, about the steps I heard outside my tent. It felt like someone had been following me, watching me, leaving things for me to find. I went over everything in my head again and again. The shoes, the folded clothes, the steps, the bottle. None of it makes sense. But it happened. I was there. And I know one thing for sure. I should have turned back when I saw the first pair of shoes.